I'm a bit nervous about being so near there. I haven't fallen in yet. We did have a speaker once, though. It was a baptismal service, and he got quite animated, and as he did so, he sort of threw his phone, and we were going, no! But it just landed short of the baptismal pool, which we were really pleased about. Now, I know we've had the bacon cob, so maybe we're feeling a bit kind of weighed down now, if you came early enough for a bacon cob. And also, we lost our alarm, and off an extra hour early, because what I did was I changed the time on my tablet. That's the trouble with everything changes itself. I changed the time on my tablet, set the alarm, so instead of going off at 10 to 7, it went off at 10 to 6. Fortunately, I was already awake, but someone else wasn't awake, and she wasn't that pleased with me, but there we go. But she was very nice about it. That's my wife, by the way, in case you wonder who it is. Yeah. Well, it could have been the cat or something, couldn't there? It's one of those days today, isn't it? Right, so I thought the way to start would be to stretch our minds. So we've got a bit of a quiz here, and I want you to tell me, firstly, who these actors are. Who's this guy? Christopher Eccleston, that's right. Kylie Minogue, did someone say? Maisie Williams. Who's that? Jenna Louise Coleman. How do you know who she is so quickly? Yeah, I should have a word with him about that. Right, so we've got Christopher Eccleston, Maisie Williams, Janie Louise Coleman. What have they got in common? Yeah, Doctor Who. Who likes Doctor Who? Yeah. Do you know when the next Doctor Who's on? The new series starts? 11th of May. It's coming up. I think the new Doctor Who's going to be really good. I really like the look of him. Now, I would love to write a script for Doctor Who. I don't think I'm ever going to get the chance, but I've got an idea for a script, for a kind of Easter script for Doctor Who. But imagine the TARDIS actually kind of lands in the church, kind of randomly just lands in the church one day. It makes that noise, lands in front of us in the church. And I say to the Doctor Who, oh, can I have a trip with you? And he said yeah, sure. Where do you want to go? And I'll say, well, it's Easter coming up. I'd really like to see what Jerusalem was like just around the time that Jesus was around. And Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead. And the Doctor says, of course I will. But as you know, the TARDIS isn't always that accurate, is it? It's always a little bit out. So the TARDIS arrives in Jerusalem just 20 years or so before Jesus comes. And we have a look round, we get a feel of the place, and we go back home. But unbeknown to us, someone who lives in Jerusalem at that time has sneaked into the TARDIS. We don't realise until we get back, the TARDIS, well, that's not quite the noise, but it makes. And we come out the TARDIS, and out comes this citizen of Jerusalem from the first century. And what's the first thing they see when they turn round? A cross. Whoa! And they kind of they'll freak out when they see the cross. I mean, we don't freak out. It's kind of the centre of things. It means so much. And they'll say, why have you got a cross there? And we explain, well, we're Christians. We are followers of Jesus. And Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead on the third day. And that's why we have a cross, because he died for us. And they might say, the cross? The cross? You can't have a cross at the centre of things. You see, to them, the cross was all about suffering, shame, and death. It was actually a really old form of execution. It was invented originally by the Persians. And the Romans were they were very powerful and very ruthless and cruel. And they, if you can use the word, perfected it to the kind of height of its cruelty so that it would be a deterrent for people who they ruled. It was for criminals. It was for revolutionaries. It was for the dregs of society. And they would leave bodies on the crosses for days and days and days. And in the end, the bodies would just get taken down and eaten by wild animals. It was a deterrent. The cross was a horrible thing. If you were walking down the road with your children and there were some people on crosses, you'd hide them away from them. You wouldn't want them to see them. But of course, to us, when we look at the cross, when we think about the cross, it's totally different. It stands for God's love and God's forgiveness, for new life and for hope. So what's the difference? Well, it's the game changer. Now, if you're not a person of faith, And you've come this morning quite wondering what this baptism is all about. Maybe Hamdi or Jean have said, can you come and support me? And you say, I suppose I better. And you've committed yourself. And then you realise it's the day the clocks go forward and you think, I've got to lose an hour's sleep as well. But I said I'd come. And you can, often that, from where I am, it's like these kind of those body heat maps. You can see the hot bits and the cold bits. I've kind of got that in mind. I can see that thing. I don't know why I came. Now, I would just say this. I'm really glad you did come. And I thank you on their behalf. And you may wonder what all this is about, and I get it. And I understand that you may well have come with assumptions about Christianity, about the faith that they're following, about Jesus. You might think that all this stuff about Jesus is boring. The author, Robert Louis Stevenson, once said, I've been to church today, and I'm not depressed. Sometimes actually it can seem so boring. I thought I'd put the radio on, and forgive me if you like the service. It was on Radio 4, and I put it on, and it was so dull. Now come to our Easter service, and Christ is risen from the dead. I remember once, and I know those of you who know me well have heard this story before, but it's for the sake of people who haven't been here. I remember once I was speaking really emphatically, and I said, I want you to know this, since I've become a Christian, I have never, ever, ever enjoyed myself. And I didn't quite mean to say that. And I couldn't, you know what it is? You can't quite pull yourself back from it. And I said, no, what I mean is I never really knew what it was to enjoy myself, but I couldn't quite get out of this. Now, you might think that's what it's like, boring. What a way to spend a Sunday morning. Or maybe you think it's untrue. It's a myth or a story set in a galaxy far, far away, but 1,000,000 miles away from where you are, or irrelevant to your life. And even if it's true, you might say, what's it got to do with me living in the 21st century? What's the story of a man who died on the cross got to do with me here and now? And I get all those objections. And I think probably Rita and Hamdi and many others here at some point have had those kind of objections, have been asking those kind of questions. And there's nothing wrong in asking that. We don't say, sign the dotted line and believe or else. We want you to come with your objections, to come with all your questions and to work them through. We want to help you do that. But what I ask you to do this morning, I just ask this, is that you bear with me so that I can explain what this is all about. And before there's anything else, there's one thing I want to get out there. The credibility of the Christian faith lies with one single individual, Jesus of Nazareth. That's why we're sitting in a building in Hucknall in Nottinghamshire in 2024. It is 2024, is it? I wasn't sure what day it was when I woke up this morning, but we're thinking about Jesus at this point in time, 2,000 odd years afterwards. We're not thinking about anyone else who lived at that time. How come a man who died a brutal form of execution, was deserted by disillusioned followers, inspires people to follow him in the 21st century? Surely we need to give him a fair hearing. And that's all I ask you to do this morning, to give him a fair hearing. So please bear with me while I take you to an account of that first Easter day that was written by a man called Luke. Now, over the last 6 weeks, actually, in this church, we've been looking at Luke. This is part of a series. But don't worry, it's not like one of those series where you have to catch up on everything in the background. Like when I watch EastEnders, I have to admit, I do quite like EastEnders. It's the accents more than anything I like. But what I have to do is sometimes look on Wikipedia. Dean, he's a baddie. What's Dean done? Because I haven't seen it for a while. I have to look and, Dean did this and Dean's father. It's like Dracula films. Everyone's related to one another, But sometimes when you get into a series, you can't work it out. But this really does stand alone. We've been looking at Luke, but I do just want to tell you, in this kind of standalone talk that we have, what we've learned about Luke. We've learned that he was a doctor. He was an early follower of Jesus. He wasn't one of the 12 original disciples, but very early on. And he wrote this account of the life of Jesus for a purpose. And he said, I've investigated Jesus. Being a doctor, he was very thorough about things. He wanted to dot the I's and cross the T's. And I should imagine it must have been a bit difficult to read his writing, because that's what doctors are like when they write prescriptions. Oh, they do it on computer now, don't they? And he talked to eyewitnesses. In fact, he traveled with one of the early Christian preachers and found out all the stories about Jesus and documented them. And he dedicated it to a person, which is a traditional thing to do at that time. And he said, look, this is written so that your faith might be grounded in Jesus, in events that really happen. So if we want to understand the story of Jesus that Luke tells us, we need to realize that the story wouldn't have been worth telling if it hadn't ended in the way that it did. That's why we need to go back to Jesus' death. Even though this is Easter Sunday, we just need to track back a little bit to Good Friday. There's a huge crowd around. Among it are some of Jesus' disciples, although a lot of them have deserted him. His mother, Mary, and the women who followed him during that ministry. An interesting thing, if Luke wanted to just fool people, he wouldn't have put so much about the women there, because in those days, unfortunately, women's views weren't counted. But Luke says they were there. God came to them. They were loyal to Jesus. He met with them. There were no crowds in support of Jesus, even though just a few days later they turned out to welcome Jesus into the city as a hero. All that were left were just a couple of dozen Galileans, overwhelmed with sorrow, confusion, and fear. And that was because the religious leaders had conspired with the Romans who ruled them to accuse Jesus of crimes he never committed and have him crucified. Jesus was the man these disciples had followed and put their hopes in for the last 3 years. They thought he was going to be the king that God had promised. He was going to rule and give them justice and freedom and forgiveness and new life in God. And 4 days earlier, they come into that city with the greetings of the crowd around him. Jesus was welcomed as a conquering hero. And at that point in time, they thought all that was left for him to just be acclaimed king, and that would be it. He would take his rightful place. And then suddenly and unexpectedly, it's over. Jesus is dead. Now, the Romans were cruel and ruthless. And the usual practice, as I said, for crucifixion was to leave the body on there for days and then just to dump the body, and it would get eaten by wild animals. It was a deterrent for people who wanted to rebel against them and who wanted to commit crime. But Luke, in the information that he's gathered as he investigated, he's discovered that there was a well-known citizen, a guy called Joseph from Arimathea. And he asked the governor, Pilate, if he could have the body of Jesus and bury him. That was highly unusual. But he was obviously an influential man and was able to get his way. He was a quiet follower of Jesus. Or in other gospel accounts, he's called a secret follower of Jesus. He didn't really want to lift his head above the parapet, but he was sympathetic to Jesus. And clearly, he believed that Jesus didn't deserve the fate of a common criminal. So he did what he could. He took Jesus' body to a newly renovated cave, and that would have been a family plot for burial. It would have been actually safe for his relatives, but he wanted Jesus to have pride of place there. And he prepared the body for burial in the way that they would have done, with spices. And he wrapped it in layers of linen. And then he headed home because it was Friday night. And as soon as sundown came, it was Saturday. That was the day of rest. That was a religious day set aside for people to worship God and to rest. And you weren't allowed to do any work at that time. Meanwhile, Jesus' disciples, Peter, James, John, and others, are huddled together somewhere in the city, trying to figure out how to get away, what to do next. Peter considers going back to the family business, which was fishing. Matthew had left his job as a tax collector, has got no real prospects. And across town, the women are gathering. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is in shock. And all that's left of Jesus' revolution is confused citizens, frightened disciples, broken-hearted women, and a devastated mother. When Jesus died, everyone, including Jesus' mother, expected him to stay dead. Yet here we are in 2024 celebrating the fact that Rita and Hamdi are saying, we follow Jesus. We want to give our lives to Jesus. We have new life in Jesus. Why is that? Well, because there's been a game changer. And this was first discovered by some women. who didn't have an inkling of what was about to happen. Now look at what Luke tells us. He says on the first day of the week, that was the Sunday, very early in the morning, well, I kind of knew what that was this morning, the women took the spice they had prepared and went to the tomb. Now, they weren't allowed to do any work until sundown on the Saturday. But you can imagine they'd have been kind of up all night. You know what it's like when you're about to go on a flight? I know some people are taking a big flight tomorrow, but the night before, you might as well not go to bed, because you just keep waking up, because you want to get on with it. You want to get out. And they would have been like that, just waiting for the first glimpse of dawn so they could get out and do something for their dead Saviour, for Jesus. And as soon as the night ended, they'd have been busy preparing the spices. After his brutal and humiliating death, Jesus could at least have some honour as he lay dead in the tomb. So at first light, the women headed towards the tomb carrying the spices they'd so carefully and lovingly prepared. But when they got there was a bit of a problem. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. Now that is quite something, because that stone would have been 4.6 feet in diameter. It would have weighed between 1 and 2 tons, and it was put there to stop grave robbers, but also there was a seal put on it by the Romans just in case anyone tried to claim that Jesus might have risen from the dead. There was no way, humanly speaking, that could have been rolled away. So already Luke is saying there's something incredible going on here. Stick with us. When they entered, we're told, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. How could Jesus be cared for if there was no body? And Luke says that they were wondering about this. And the word that he uses in the original language means they were so troubled they just didn't know where to turn. You ever been like that? You're lost or somewhere, you're lost somewhere, or you've lost something, or something really bad's happened, and you just don't know what to do. That's the meaning of the word there. They were really distressed. But suddenly, 2 men in clothes gleamed like lightning and stood behind them. So it's clear that they weren't ordinary people. I mean, their clothes gleam like lightning. They were beings from heaven. We'd call them angels, but don't think about kind of the pretty pictures of angels with wings. They were God's messengers sent from heaven. They were celestial beings. And it would have been a bit of a scary sight. And in fact, we're told, in their fright, the women bowed with their face to the ground. But remember, these heavenly beings, these messengers of God, were stood beside them because that was to give them comfort. And they had a couple of important things to say. They hadn't just come there for effect. They'd come there with a message from God about Jesus. But it's interesting that they started with a question. Why do you look for the living among the dead? Yeah, I love the way they did that. I love the way they engaged their minds. They didn't just say, oh, no, you silly women, just believe. No. They asked that question just to get their minds reeling. There's nothing like a good question to get your mind warmed up and to think. And this is radical as well. Remember, and I don't mean this in any sexist way, because this was the 1st century, and women's opinions weren't counted. A woman's evidence wouldn't count in court. But they wanted to engage the minds of these women because they were the ones who were following Jesus closely and stayed loyal to them. Come on, think about it. Why would Jesus be there when he's alive? Don't you realize what's going on? And then they announced the fantastic news. He's not here. He has risen. And to underlie that, they reminded them of Jesus' words. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee. The Son of Man, and that's a name that Jesus used to describe himself, must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the 3rd day, rise from the dead. Now, when you read through Luke's document, you can see that on various occasions, Jesus told the disciples about this. And it's interesting they reminded the women about this because it showed that they were part of the larger groups of disciples. They were kind of disciples by de facto. And in fact, they were better listeners than the men were. Don't you remember? Don't you remember the times that Jesus said he was going to go to the cross and 3 days later he was going to rise from the dead? Now, to be fair on them, they would have believed in the resurrection, but resurrection to them was something a bit different. It was something that would happen at the end of time when God would give his people new bodies and a new kind of life. And actually, in many ways, they're correct, because we will all know that resurrection if we trust in Jesus. But nobody dreamed that a single person would be killed and raised to a new sort of bodily life and start a whole new movement in his name. It was a game changer. It's no wonder at that point they remembered his words, Jesus' words. In other words, it all fell into pieces. It's when you realize something once and for all. The tense of it means that they realized, and that was it. They knew. You know what it's like when there's a puzzle or something and suddenly the last piece is in place and you think, I get it. It's like, have you ever seen that film? I think it's called The Sixth Sense, is it? I can't remember what it's called now, but there's a film which a boy's with Bruce Willis, and he keeps saying to Bruce Willis, I see dead people. I see dead people. And at the end of the film, this is a spoiler, but it's an old film. At the end of the film, you discover actually that Bruce Willis is a dead person, and that's why he's seeing him all the time. And actually, you can't watch that film twice. If you want to watch that now, you can't, can you? I've given the game away. That's the end, It's done. You understand it. And suddenly, it all figured. Everything comes into place. And what do you do when you have news like that? Well, the tomb was empty, Jesus had risen, the focus had changed from death to life. What do? They want to just go and tell the others that good news. And you know what it's like when you come in and you're really excited and someone pours freezing cold water on them? Well, that's what happened to them. They went and told the disciples, but we're told they did not believe the women because the word seemed to them like nonsense. And the word translated as nonsense describes someone who's completely delirious. And remember, of course, in that culture, the words of women didn't really count for much. But there was one person who broke ranks. The interesting thing was, this was the person who let Jesus down big time. He denied Jesus, as we saw in that Lego video. Peter, however, we're told, got up and ran to the tomb. He wanted to find out more. He was eager to do it. And bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves. Now, that is a really important detail, because the strips of linen would have been wrapped around Jesus' body. And actually, when Jesus rose from the dead, he would have kind of broken those off. When you're asleep, let's say you're asleep and someone kind of ties things round you, and you wake up and you just get them off, or, the bedclothes are all around you, and you throw them off because it's the beginning of the day. That's the kind of idea there. The linen was thrown off because Jesus wasn't dead anymore. And it's interesting, his reaction. There was this clear sign. The tomb was empty. The linen was gone. The ladies had said that the angels had said Jesus was alive. How did Peter react? Did he say, yes, I believe it? No, he didn't. And actually, I'm glad that he reacted this way. He went away wondering what had happened. He wanted to know more. And the word wondering means he had a sense of awe, but he wasn't quite there. It didn't all quite fall into place. He wanted to find out more about what this talk of the empty tomb was all about. And the great news is that Jesus didn't leave the women, Peter, and the others wondering. Later on in the afternoon, Jesus visits his followers in the city. He speaks words of peace because suddenly Jesus is among them and he says, peace be with you. He tells them to touch his side and see he's a real person. He's not a ghost. He even eats with them to prove that. And then he explains what this game changer is all about. And he said, yes, it was written long ago that the Messiah would suffer and die and rise from the dead on the third day. Yeah, this wasn't an accident, he's saying. This was the plan. This was what God the Father wanted all along. And this was foretold by people many, many years ago whom God had given that message to. And now I fulfilled it. It was also written in this message that would be proclaimed in the authority of his name to all nations, beginning in Jerusalem. There's a message that's coming from this. There's a message I want you to tell everyone. There's a message I want you to hear, he says. What's this message? It's amazing. There is forgiveness of sins for all who repent. See, that's what it's all about. That's why Jesus went to the cross, and that's why Jesus rose from the dead. He went there to bring us forgiveness, because the Bible tells us, we know that we are all separated from God. There's this barrier that's called sin. But I've come to bring forgiveness, he said, and I've brought it, and it's proven in the fact that I've conquered death. And it's at this point the disciples re-engage with his mission, because they met with the risen Jesus. They knew who he was, they believed he'd risen from the dead, and they saw the purpose that he had come to fulfill, to bring about forgiveness of sins. And that's why Jesus finished with those important words. You are witnesses of those things. Yeah, Luke's gathered this eyewitness account from them. That's why it's game on for faith. The resurrection of Jesus isn't a Bible story. It's the story. It's what the Bible's all about. The Bible's there because Jesus rose from the dead. It intersects with your story, my story, Rita's story, Hamdi's story, everyone's story. The resurrection of Jesus means that he achieved what he set out to do. Jesus died for our sins. He rose to bring us into a new relationship with God. His crucifixion made no sense to his followers without the resurrection. The resurrection was the game changer. It was why the story was told. It was why the cross, that used to be a symbol of shame and suffering, suddenly became a symbol of power and new life. There's a story that George Bush Sr., George Bush, who used to be the president of America many years ago, he told about when he was ambassador to Moscow. And he went to the funeral of one of the communist rulers. And if you don't, some of you may be too young to remember communism. And in communism, you had to be an atheist. You couldn't believe in God. You know, the belief in God was outlawed. And George Bush made this observation. And he saw that in all the sadness, Brezhnev's widow came to the coffin and she made a sign of the cross. And George Bush reflected on that and said, this was amazing. There was this woman in this communist state, married to someone who led it and discouraged belief in God, and suddenly she wanted to think about the cross. Suddenly she looked for hope and she looked to the cross. Why is the cross that sign of hope? Why is it a message of hope? Because Jesus has risen from the dead. It's why Rita and Hamdi are getting baptized this morning. Because they want to follow the risen Jesus. Because they want you to know what's happened to them. Because when they're lowered into the water, they're going to say their old life has gone. And when they come back up again, they're saying they're raised to new life. Before we hear what they got to say and watch them get baptized, I want to ask you, how are you going to respond to this? Maybe you're going to be like Peter, who investigated. And we'd like to help you do that. And we've got these booklets, Why Easter, that we want to give you. And if you get at the door, look for Richard. He's the good-looking fellow at the door there. He'll give you a copy of that. We'd love you to read that. We'd love you to come and ask us questions about that. Maybe you're like the women. You want to think it through. Oh, come and join our Alpha course. Or maybe just come back next week. But whatever you do, please don't walk away from this game changer.